Ladies and gentlemen, sometimes the person who broke you wasn't sent to bless you. They were sent to wake you. And that's why God let you face that narcissist. Not because he wanted you to suffer, but because he wanted you to see. To see what love isn't. To see what self-worth really means. To see what happens when you keep pouring into someone who only drinks from your peace and never gives you a drop of theirs. Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in your life when you sit on the edge of your bed at 2 a.m., staring into the dark, and you whisper to yourself, "Why did I have to go through that?" You replay conversations that broke you, moments that confused you, and a relationship that didn't just hurt your heart. It wounded your spirit. You think about the narcissist who came into your life and left you questioning everything about who you are. And the truth that nobody likes to hear is that sometimes God allows those very people to enter our lives, not as punishment, but as exposure. Exposure of what we couldn't see, what we ignored, and what we didn't know about ourselves. The narcissist wasn't a random encounter. They were the mirror you didn't ask for but desperately needed. Because before they came, you thought your boundaries were strong. You thought you knew your worth. You thought love was about giving, forgiving, and proving your loyalty. But that relationship showed you what blind loyalty costs. It showed you how loving without discernment becomes self-destruction. God didn't allow them to stay to ruin you. He allowed them to appear to reveal you. When we ask God for strength, we expect Him to give us peace. But strength doesn't grow in peace, it grows in conflict. It grows when your emotions are pulled in every direction. And you have to decide who you are when everything inside you is begging for validation. That's where God starts teaching you what boundaries really mean. Because a boundary isn't just about saying no to others. It's about saying yes to your peace, your dignity, and your worth. And the narcissist, they test every single one of those yeses until you realize your energy is sacred currency, not community property. The exposure wasn't about them being cruel. It was about you seeing your patterns. You see, the narcissist is a master at identifying your emotional needs. They'll find the parts of you that crave love, attention, and affirmation, and they'll mirror them perfectly. They make you feel seen, admired, even chosen. That's how they gain access. But then comes the withdrawal, the sudden coldness, the indifference, the emotional games that make you question what you did wrong. That's where the exposure begins. Because in that confusion, you start to realize something deeper. You realize that love that keeps you anxious isn't love. It's control disguised as affection. You realize that if you have to beg for clarity, it's not intimacy, it's manipulation. You realize that when someone uses your empathy as a weapon, your biggest strength becomes your biggest vulnerability. And that's the moment when the mirror turns back on you. God allowed you to face that narcissist so you could finally meet yourself. The version of you that you've been neglecting while trying to fix everyone else. You were too busy trying to heal people who had no intention of changing. You believed that love could save them, that your patience could reform them. But what you didn't see was that your energy was being drained, your self-trust was eroding, and your identity was being quietly rewritten by someone who thrived on your confusion. The truth is, exposure is uncomfortable. It's not glamorous. It's not romantic. It's brutal. Because to truly see yourself, you have to face where you gave too much, where you stayed too long, and where you silenced your intuition just to keep the peace. The narcissist is a walking test of your self-awareness. They force you to choose between what feels familiar and what feels right. Because for many people, chaos feels familiar and peace feels foreign. You think, if I just love harder, they'll see my value. But love doesn't convince the wrong person. It only exhausts the right one. So God allowed this person not to destroy your confidence, but to reveal the cracks that were already there. The parts of you that equated attention with affection. The parts that believed love must be earned instead of mutually given. The parts that confused chemistry with compatibility. Because when you don't heal those parts, you attract people who exploit them. And yes, it hurts. It hurts because the exposure strips away your illusions. It shows you that what you called love was really survival. You were addicted to the highs and lows, mistaking unpredictability for passion. You were chasing validation from someone who used your desire to be loved as leverage. But this pain was necessary because you cannot heal what you keep romanticizing. That's why God let you face that narcissist, to expose your hidden wounds, to show you that you didn't just need to be loved, you needed to be healed, to teach you that love without respect is poison, and that the wrong person can't block what's meant for you. They can only redirect you to find it within yourself first. Sometimes God doesn't remove the narcissist immediately because the lesson hasn't sunk in yet. You're still hoping they'll change, still negotiating your worth, still praying they'll wake up one day and realize what they lost. But God isn't trying to change them. He's trying to awaken you. Every time you go back, the lesson grows louder. Every time you tolerate manipulation, the silence of your spirit grows heavier, until one day you stop asking why they did it and start asking why you allowed it. That's divine exposure, not a punishment, but a revelation. You start seeing patterns. You recognize that the narcissist wasn't your first encounter with control. They were just the loudest one. You remember times in your childhood when love felt conditional, when your emotions were invalidated, when you learned that being needed was safer than being seen, and suddenly you realized this person wasn't new. They were familiar. God allowed the narcissist so you could trace the root of your pain back to where it started and finally pull it out by the root. Because true healing isn't just walking away. It's understanding why you stayed. When the exposure happens, it's painful because it's personal. It attacks the very parts of you that crave connection. But that's where growth lives. In that discomfort, in that self-awareness, you begin to learn that protecting your peace isn't rejection, it's self-respect. You learn that the people who genuinely love you don't make you question your reality. You learn that love that costs you your sanity isn't love. It's emotional debt. So while you're crying over what you lost, God is smiling over what you're finding. Yourself. That's the divine trade. You lose the illusion, you gain the truth. You lose the fantasy, you gain freedom. And when that happens, you begin to understand that the exposure was never meant to shame you. It was meant to empower you. And then comes the next phase, pain as a teacher. Because after the exposure comes the education. The classroom of heartbreak teaches lessons that comfort never could. It teaches you to slow down and listen to what your emotions are trying to tell you. It teaches you that pain isn't punishment. It's a messenger. A messenger that says, something inside you needs your attention. Pain teaches clarity. It strips away distractions. When your heart breaks, the noise of illusion fades and the voice of truth becomes deafening. You start remembering who you were before the manipulation, before the gaslighting, before the confusion. Pain pushes you toward honesty, because when everything falls apart, you can no longer pretend. You can't keep convincing yourself that things are fine when they're not. Pain demands authenticity. You begin to realize that the very moments that felt unbearable were shaping your emotional intelligence. Every tear was refining your discernment. Every sleepless night was building your patience. Pain teaches you what peace really feels like because, for the first time, you recognize its absence. And once you taste genuine peace, chaos no longer feels exciting. It feels repulsive. That's how you know healing has begun. Pain is also the teacher that introduces you to your standards. Before the heartbreak, your standards were words. After the heartbreak, they become boundaries. You no longer say, I want honesty. You live in a way that doesn't tolerate dishonesty. You no longer say, "I deserve respect." You move with the confidence of someone who enforces it. The pain that broke you is the same pain that builds your backbone. It's easy to say you know your worth when life is calm, but true worth is proven in your choices when life is chaotic. When you can walk away from someone who keeps playing with your emotions. That's self-worth. When you can stop trying to explain your boundaries to people who keep crossing them. That's growth. When you can say, "I love you, but I love myself more." That's healing. The pain also humbles you. It shows you that you are not invincible, that your empathy has limits, and that your love needs direction. It teaches you compassion, not just for others, but for yourself. Because you start forgiving yourself for not knowing better, for staying too long, for confusing loyalty with love. That forgiveness becomes freedom. Because guilt keeps you bound to the lesson, but grace lets you walk out of it wiser. Every time you revisit the memories, something new clicks. You see that the person who manipulated you was deeply broken. You see that their cruelty wasn't a reflection of your unworthiness, but of their emptiness. Pain teaches you to separate your value from their behavior. You start realizing that what they couldn't give you had nothing to do with you not deserving it. They were incapable of love because love requires accountability. And accountability is the one thing narcissists run from. Pain turns you into an observer of energy. You start noticing red flags earlier, not because you're paranoid, but because you're aware. You feel the energy shift when someone's intentions don't match their words. You pick up on manipulation in silence, not speech. You stop excusing behavior that doesn't align with your peace. That's the education that pain provides. It makes you fluent in emotional truth. And then something beautiful happens. The same situations that once triggered your insecurity now activate your intuition. The same kind of people that once attracted you now bore you. You don't chase the thrill of unpredictability anymore. You crave the calm of consistency. That's the transformation pain creates. It turns your triggers into teachers, your wounds into wisdom, your vulnerability into vision. You begin to thank God for the very experience that once broke you. Because now, you see what He was doing. You see that He wasn't ignoring your prayers. He was answering them through growth. You asked to be stronger, and He gave you experiences that required strength. You asked to know your worth, and He let someone treat you in a way that forced you to find it. You asked for discernment, and He gave you deception so you could learn how to see truth. Pain was the process that refined your spirit. It's through that process that you become unrecognizable, not just to others, but to yourself. You stop reacting emotionally to every trigger. You stop needing closure from people who never intended to give it. You start understanding that your healing doesn't depend on their apology. It depends on your decision to move forward. You stop being shocked by manipulation because you now see it as evidence of someone's emptiness, not your inadequacy. That's when you realize pain isn't something to run from. It's something to learn from. It doesn't define you, it refines you. It removes what's false so that what's real can emerge. You start to carry yourself differently, not because you're bitter, but because you're better. You speak with clarity, move with intention, and love with boundaries. You stop needing people to understand your value because you've already understood it yourself. And though it hurts to admit, you recognize that the narcissist was never the lesson. You were. You were the one being shaped, molded, strengthened. They were just the chisels in the hands of a divine sculptor. Every wound they caused became a doorway for wisdom. Every heartbreak became an introduction to your higher self. And every disappointment became preparation for the kind of love that won't require you to shrink to be chosen. You realize pain didn't take your softness. It gave you strategy. You're still capable of love, but now it's a love with awareness. You give, but you also protect. You trust, but you verify. You care deeply, but you no longer abandon yourself in the process. That's the transformation pain creates. Not a harder heart, but a wiser one. God lets you face that narcissist, because without that encounter, you wouldn't have learned that peace isn't the absence of problems. It's the presence of boundaries. You wouldn't have learned that love isn't about proving your worth. It's about sharing it with someone who recognizes it. You wouldn't have learned that pain isn't your enemy. It's your instructor. And when you walk into your next chapter, you carry all those lessons quietly within you. You no longer need to explain yourself. You no longer need validation. You move differently because you've seen what pretending costs. You smile differently because you know peace isn't something you find in another person. It's something you create when you refuse to lose yourself again. And through all of this, God is whispering, now you're ready. Ready to love differently. Ready to see clearly. Ready to walk in a strength that was forged in fire. The narcissist didn't destroy you. They revealed you. The pain didn't defeat you. It taught you. And you, even in your brokenness, were never abandoned. You were being educated by experience, guided by grace, and prepared for a love that will no longer demand your pain as proof of your loyalty. There comes a point after the pain where your heart stops asking for explanations and starts craving understanding. You stop wanting to know why they lied, and you start wanting to know why you believed them. You stop trying to make sense of the chaos they created and start realizing how deeply you wanted to believe in the illusion. That's where the real transformation begins. When the illusion starts to break. Because God doesn't just expose the narcissist. He dismantles the fantasy that kept you attached to them. You didn't fall in love with who they were. You fell in love with who they pretended to be. You fell in love with their potential, with the glimpses of goodness they strategically gave you just enough of to keep you hopeful. They knew how to say all the right things, how to touch the parts of your soul that longed for connection, how to make you believe that this time it was real. But love built on illusion is like building a castle on sand. It looks beautiful until the tide comes in. The narcissist knows exactly how to play that game. They study your empathy. They test your patience. They observe how much you're willing to tolerate. And then they start feeding you just enough crumbs of affection to keep you hungry. The illusion becomes addictive. The intermittent kindness, the apologies that sound sincere, the promises that sparkle with possibility. You start confusing inconsistency for intensity. The chaos becomes a drug, and you tell yourself that the highs are worth the lows, because when it's good, it's so good. But that's not love. That's dependency disguised as passion. Breaking the illusion means facing the truth about your role in the cycle. It means admitting that part of you was addicted to fixing them. You saw their brokenness and thought your love could heal it. You kept telling yourself, if I just love them enough, they'll change. But that mindset doesn't come from love. It comes from a deep fear of not being enough. And that fear is exactly what keeps you tied to people who drain you. God allowed that illusion to break because you needed to learn the difference between love and attachment. Love is mutual. It flows freely, without manipulation, without mind games. Attachment clings to what feels familiar, even if it's painful. When you confuse the two, you end up mistaking chaos for chemistry and emotional neglect for emotional depth. You end up trying to earn what was never yours to prove. When God begins to dismantle that illusion, it feels like the world is collapsing. You start seeing patterns that you ignored. You remember the lies you explained away, the red flags you minimized, the boundaries you abandoned. The truth begins to sting, but that sting is sacred. It's your awakening. Because truth doesn't hurt you, it frees you. What hurts is the part of you that still wants the lie to be true. You start realizing that the person you thought you loved never truly existed. They were a projection, a performance. Narcissists are excellent actors, and you were cast in the role of their admirer, their healer, their emotional supply. The moment you stop feeding that role, the mask slips. And when it does, it's not just shocking, it's devastating. Because you see how much of yourself you gave to a fantasy. But that devastation is necessary, because without it, you'd still be living in denial. Breaking illusions is like detoxing from a powerful drug. You go through withdrawal. You miss the person they pretended to be. You crave the emotional highs. You replay the good moments in your mind, trying to convince yourself that maybe it wasn't that bad. But deep down, you know the truth. Those moments were manufactured to keep you hooked. The love, bombing, the compliments, the promises. They were never real connection. They were strategy. This is where God's lesson deepens. He teaches you that real love doesn't need illusions to survive. Real love doesn't manipulate your emotions to maintain control. Real love is steady, consistent, peaceful. But to receive that kind of love, you must first detox from the counterfeit version. You must learn to find peace boring only because chaos once felt like home. So he lets the illusion shatter, not because he wants to break your heart, but because he wants to rebuild your vision. You can't see clearly when your lens is fogged by fantasy. You can't discern truth when you're addicted to potential. The shattering is grace in disguise. It's God saying, I won't let you live in delusion any longer. It's hard to let go of a fantasy, especially when it's built on your deepest hopes. You imagined a future with them. You planned your life around the version of them that existed only in your imagination. You defended them to others, excused them to yourself, justified their behavior, because admitting the truth would have meant admitting you were wrong. But growth always requires humility, and humility means saying, I was wrong about them, but I'm right to walk away. You stop chasing closure because you realize closure doesn't come from them. It comes from clarity. You don't need them to validate your experience. You don't need them to admit what they did. You don't even need them to regret losing you. Because the moment you accept reality, the illusion loses its power. You stop needing to fix the story, and you start rewriting your own. That's when God begins his redirection. When the illusion breaks, you're left with silence. No more drama, no more chaos, no more emotional fireworks. Just quiet. And that quiet feels unbearable at first. You're so used to fighting for attention, for affection, for understanding, that peace feels unnatural. But that's where the divine redirection begins. Because in that silence, you start hearing your own voice again. The one you silenced for their comfort. The one you ignored to keep the relationship alive. The one that whispers, this isn't love. This isn't peace. A God redirects through chaos. What looks like rejection is actually protection. What feels like abandonment is often realignment. When he removes the narcissist from your life, it's not because he's taking something from you. It's because he's making room for something that won't require you to suffer to feel seen. He's saying, you can't carry this weight where I'm taking you. The redirection doesn't make sense at first. You'll find yourself wanting to reach out, wanting to understand why it ended the way it did, wanting to go back just one more time to feel closure. But God doesn't allow certain doors to reopen because he knows what you're still tempted to justify. He knows that if he gave you what you want, you'd settle for less than what you need. So instead, he lets the confusion push you toward clarity. You might think you lost a person, but what you really lost was the version of yourself that accepted inconsistency as love. You lost the version of yourself that kept apologizing just to keep the peace. You lost the version that needed to be chosen by someone incapable of choosing anyone but themselves. That loss is sacred. It's the death of your false self. And in its place, God begins to build someone new, Someone stronger, wiser, unshakable. Redirection often comes disguised as isolation. God will separate you from people, environments, and patterns that keep you stuck. Not because He wants you lonely, but because He needs you focused. You can't heal while you're still listening to the same lies that broke you. You can't move forward while you're still waiting for validation from the person who wounded you. So He isolates you to reintroduce you to yourself. It's in that isolation that you start remembering your worth. You start realizing how much energy you gave away to someone who never deserved it. You start seeing how you shrunk yourself to fit their comfort, how you over-explained, over-apologized, over-loved. And you realize that the love you gave wasn't wasted. It was preparation. You learned how deeply you can care, how much you can give, how loyal you can be. You just learned it in the wrong classroom. Redirection teaches gratitude. It turns your heartbreak into humility. You stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start saying, "Thank you for removing what was never meant for me." You start seeing God's fingerprints all over your past. The rejection that felt unbearable, it saved you. The ending that made you question your worth, it refined it. The silence that felt cruel, it protected your peace. God redirects your energy too. Where you once poured everything into trying to understand them, you now pour that energy into understanding yourself. You start setting boundaries not to control others, but to protect your peace. You learn to listen to your intuition. That small, quiet voice that always knew something was off. You stop second guessing it because now you recognize that was God speaking through your spirit the entire time. As the redirection unfolds, you begin to see how everything was orchestrated for your growth. Every heartbreak, every disappointment, every unanswered question, all of it led you closer to yourself. You were never meant to lose your light. You were meant to learn how to protect it. And that's what divine redirection does. It teaches you discernment. Discernment isn't paranoia. It's peace that refuses to entertain confusion. It's the wisdom to recognize that not every apology deserves a response. Not every connection deserves your investment. Not every attraction deserves your energy. You learn to stop chasing closure from people who specialize in chaos. You stop romanticizing potential and start prioritizing consistency. You stop asking, "Do they love me?" and start asking, "Do I feel loved?" Redirection also changes your standards permanently. You stop being impressed by words and start observing patterns. You stop being flattered by attention and start valuing effort. You stop mistaking intensity for intimacy. The same traits that once drew you in, the charm, the charisma, the mystery, now raise red flags instead of butterflies. That's growth. You begin to understand that sometimes God allows you to face a narcissist because that experience creates spiritual maturity. It sharpens your discernment in a way that no sermon, no book, no advice ever could. You've lived it. You've seen manipulation up close. You've felt the sting of deceit. And that first-hand experience becomes your spiritual training ground. You become someone who doesn't just talk about boundaries. You embody them. Redirection also gives you purpose. When you heal from that kind of pain, you start realizing that your story has power. The lessons you learned become the light that guides others out of their own darkness. You find yourself saying things like, "I've been there, and I promise you'll make it through." Because you know what it feels like to question your worth. And you also know what it feels like to rediscover it. Your healing becomes your ministry. Your growth becomes your gift. And then, one day, you look back at the person you used to be, the one who tolerated manipulation, who kept hoping they'd change, who confused love with suffering, and you realize how far you've come. You're not the same. You speak differently. You think differently. You choose differently. You've been redirected into a version of yourself that honors your value. You no longer chase what confuses you. You attract what aligns with your peace. That's the beauty of divine redirection. It doesn't just change your circumstances, it changes your identity. You stop identifying as the person who was hurt and start living as the person who healed. You stop telling stories about what they did to you and start sharing what you learned through it. The pain loses its power because purpose replaces it. You start to understand that everything you went through wasn't wasted. The exposure, the heartbreak, the illusion, the chaos, all of it was a divine curriculum designed to elevate your awareness. You were never being punished. You were being promoted. Promoted to a new level of emotional intelligence, self-worth, and spiritual maturity. God doesn't waste pain. He repurposes it. And when you reach that level of awareness, you stop resenting the narcissist. You don't excuse their behavior, but you understand it. You see them as a lesson in disguise, a teacher you never asked for, but deeply needed. You realize that their role in your story was temporary, but their impact was eternal. They awakened something in you. A standard, a strength, a spiritual clarity that can't be shaken. God redirected you because you had outgrown that version of yourself. He knew you were ready for a life that no longer depended on validation from broken people. He knew you were ready to see yourself the way He sees you, whole, worthy, and powerful beyond measure. And to get you there, He had to remove what kept you blind. So, when the illusion breaks and the redirection begins, you might feel lost, but you're actually being found. You might feel empty, but that's just space being cleared for peace. You might feel alone, but you're never abandoned. You're being guided, rebuilt, and prepared for something greater than you can imagine. Something real, something peaceful, something sacred. And that's where the story continues to unfold. Into what comes next when you begin to grow spiritually through everything you've endured, when discernment becomes your protection, and when your healing becomes the foundation for a new kind of love that doesn't demand your pain as proof of your devotion. There comes a moment when everything you tried to fix stops working. You've prayed, pleaded, reasoned, explained, and justified, but nothing changes. That moment isn't failure. It's redirection. The door you kept knocking on doesn't open, not because you were unworthy, but because God decided that door would lead you somewhere you were never meant to stay. When you face a narcissist, it's easy to think you were cursed with the wrong person. But what if that person was actually the tool God used to move you toward your purpose? Some people don't come to love you, they come to relocate you. They arrive to shake your sense of comfort, to stir your spirit until you can no longer tolerate mediocrity disguised as love. When you were with that person, you may have ignored your inner voice. You silenced your gut to maintain peace. You became so accustomed to shrinking yourself that you called it compromise. Every time you tried to explain your needs, they twisted your words until you questioned your sanity. That cycle wasn't just cruelty. It was a divine setup. God allowed you to witness the ugliest form of manipulation so that you could never again mistake attention for affection. He allowed you to taste emptiness so that you'd recognize fullness when it finally appeared. When the narcissist entered your life, they didn't just break your heart. They broke the illusion. They shattered the fantasy that love is earned through suffering. You were meant to be rerouted, not ruined. The confusion you felt was God whispering that your location no longer matched your purpose. You were living in a space that had expired, connected to a person who thrived on your hesitation. So when the tower fell, you weren't being punished, you were being freed. Every unanswered call, every ignored message, every cruel silence was part of a bigger plan to detach you from what couldn't sustain the version of you that God was building. Sometimes God removes your peace until you move. You prayed for strength, but strength often comes disguised as loss. You asked for direction, but direction sometimes shows up as rejection. That narcissist became your compass. Not because they guided you kindly, but but because their chaos made you desperate for calm. You learned to value stability because you experienced instability. You learned to appreciate honesty because you tasted deception. Without that contrast, you wouldn't have developed discernment. And discernment is how God protects your destiny. You see, when God reroutes you, He doesn't always send an angel with a gentle hand. Sometimes He sends a narcissist with a sharp tongue. It's not pretty, but it's purposeful. Because there are seasons when comfort won't grow you anymore. You needed something that would shake your spirit so deeply that you'd never settle again. That's what the narcissist did. They made you so uncomfortable in dysfunction that you started craving peace more than validation. You stopped begging to be seen and started realizing your worth doesn't depend on someone else's blindness. You thought you were losing them, but you were really losing the version of yourself that tolerated mistreatment. That's the redirection. The moment you stop chasing what's breaking you. There's a reason why after certain heartbreaks, you can't go back to who you were before. It's because God rerouted your identity. He allowed you to outgrow what once defined you. The narcissist served their role. They exposed what you believed about love. And once you learned the lesson, their access expired. If you look back closely, you'll see divine fingerprints all over that escape. The day you couldn't sleep, because your spirit was restless. The moment you finally stopped defending them to others, the quiet voice that told you, enough. Those weren't coincidences. They were signals. God was saying, I've got to move you, even if it breaks you first. Because sometimes, if He doesn't let the narcissist hurt you, you'll never leave. You'll keep trying to redeem something that was never meant to be holy. You didn't walk away because you stopped caring. You walked away because God turned their charm into chaos, their attention into exhaustion, their affection into confusion. What once felt magnetic started to feel suffocating, and that shift wasn't random. It was alignment. You were stepping out of manipulation and into clarity. You were starting to see them as they truly were, not as you hoped they'd become. That's divine redirection. The process of truth replacing illusion. When you look back now, don't just remember what they did. Remember who you became through it. You learned resilience. You discovered boundaries. You started speaking up for yourself, even when your voice shook. You stopped apologizing for existing. You learned that silence can be strength and walking away can be wisdom. Every time they tried to break your spirit, they were unknowingly building your backbone. They thought they were destroying you, but they were actually helping you step into spiritual independence, that state where your peace no longer depends on someone else's approval. And here's the beauty. Once God reroutes you, He doesn't send you back to the same kind of test. You don't attract narcissists in the same way when you've healed. They sense your strength and lose interest. They realize they can't manipulate someone who no longer needs validation. You stop craving their attention because you've tasted your own peace. And once you've experienced that, chaos loses its flavor. That's when you start stepping into purpose. When you survive a narcissist, you don't just survive a person. You survive a system of emotional warfare. You survive mental manipulation that trained you to doubt your own intuition. Coming out of that isn't just recovery, it's rebirth. You start to see your life differently. You begin to understand that purpose often emerges from the deepest wounds. You can't guide others out of darkness unless you've navigated it yourself. So when you rise with a story, not of victimhood, but of transformation. Purpose is born when pain meets awareness. You stop asking, why me? And start asking, what now? That's when you realize the narcissist wasn't the end. They were the beginning of your becoming. They forced you to confront parts of yourself that were still dependent on external love. They pushed you to see that peace isn't found in someone's arms, it's found in your alignment with truth. Every tear you shed watered the soil of your next chapter. You were being prepared, not punished. When you step into purpose after that kind of storm, you walk differently. You speak with more certainty. You love with more boundaries. You no longer confuse chaos with chemistry. You stop performing for attention because you've learned that peace doesn't need an audience. Purpose gives you that quiet confidence, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything. You start making decisions that serve your soul, not your loneliness. That's what God was after all along. Not your comfort, but your clarity. You were meant to lead, to inspire, to show others that healing isn't about pretending it never happened. It's about walking through the fire and coming out refined. You can't teach strength from theory, you teach it from experience. That's why He let you face that narcissist. So when someone else is trapped in confusion, you'll have the empathy and wisdom to say, "I know what that feels like, but you can survive it." There's a reason survivors of manipulation often become guides, coaches, or voices for others. Because they carry the kind of insight that can't be learned from books. It's earned through pain. You begin to recognize patterns in others' behavior. You start to sense when someone's energy doesn't match their words. That's discernment, a spiritual superpower born from surviving deception. That's how purpose works. God takes what was meant to destroy you and turns it into the foundation of your calling. You might not have realized it then, but when everything collapsed, you were being upgraded. The version of you that walked into that relationship wasn't equipped for where you're going next. You needed self-worth, resilience, patience, and wisdom. And the only way to develop those was through pressure. Diamonds don't form without heat. Gold isn't purified without fire. You can't become who you're meant to be without going through something that tests every layer of your identity. That's why when you look back, you'll start to thank the very season you once cursed. Because it woke you up. It forced you to choose yourself. It taught you how to say no without guilt. It taught you how to protect your energy like it's sacred, because it is. Every time you said yes to someone who drained you, you were betraying the mission God placed on your life. But now, you see that loving yourself isn't arrogance, it's stewardship. You're taking care of the vessel that's carrying divine purpose. Stepping into purpose isn't about forgetting what happened, it's about reassigning meaning to it. You can't erase the past, but you can redefine it. Instead of saying, "That relationship broke me," you start saying, "That relationship built my awareness." Instead of saying, "They wasted my time," you say, "They prepared me for discernment." Purpose is when pain becomes productive. You begin using your story instead of being used by it. That's why the storm had to come. You were never meant to build your life on someone else's approval. You were meant to stand on your own faith, your own clarity, your own peace. The narcissist was the demolition crew. They tore down everything that wasn't stable so you could rebuild with stronger foundations. And now you're building differently, slower, wiser, more intentional. You no longer rush into connections, you observe. You no longer chase, you attract. You no longer beg to be chosen because you've already chosen yourself. Purpose gives you peace that doesn't depend on circumstances. You can be alone and feel full. You can face rejection and still know your worth. You can look at what didn't work out and feel gratitude instead of bitterness. Because you understand, every person who left made space for who's meant to stay. Every door that closed protected you from what would have distracted you from destiny. That's not loss. That's divine strategy. You may not have understood it when you were crying at 3 a.m., replaying conversations in your mind, wondering what you could have done differently. But now you see, it was never about being perfect for them. It was about becoming whole for you. The narcissist triggered your transformation. They were the storm that revealed your anchor. And once you realize that, You stop resenting the test because you see how it shaped the testimony. Purpose doesn't erase the scars. It gives them meaning. You'll still remember the manipulation, but it won't sting anymore. You'll still recall the lies, but they won't define you. You'll remember the moment you walked away, and instead of pain, you'll feel pride, because that was the moment your spirit reclaimed its power. You stopped existing in survival mode and started living in spiritual authority. That's where you are now, the place where peace feels like home, not boredom. The place where boundaries aren't walls, but gates that guard your purpose. The place where you don't need to prove your worth to anyone because you know your Creator already validated you before anyone could reject you. This is what divine redirection and purpose look like: peace after chaos, clarity after confusion, power after pain. And all of it began with the person who once made you question everything about yourself. The one who made you doubt your voice. The one who made you feel small. They thought they were taking from you, but God was using them to give something far greater. Wisdom, strength, and identity. You may not have chosen that experience, but you get to choose what it becomes. That's what walking in purpose looks like. Transforming every wound into wisdom, every loss into light, every ending into evolution. Because when you finally see that the narcissist wasn't a mistake, but a mission, your whole story changes. You stop living in resentment and start living in revelation. You stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and start declaring, "This happened for me." You become living proof that pain doesn't destroy, it develops. And the moment you embrace that, you step fully into the person God always knew you could become.